Good morning again, everyone. Welcome to another stage of our travel through that magnificent mess that was the Elizabethan government. In the first lesson of this unit, we talked about the court, the Queen's inner circle where important people met and when political decisions were taken. Then we looked at the Privy Council and how it was a mirror of the social and religious developments of the country. Today, we will look at the last and least important branch of the Elizabethan government, Parliament. Today we'll examine three main points. First, actually four main points. First, the old and new parliament, how Tudor parliaments were absolutely nothing like the modern ones. Then we'll look at late medieval and Tudor parliaments, and we will see what were Tudor parliaments used for anyway. Then we'll look at Elizabeth and Parliament, when she called in the Assembly and when she listened to it or ignored it. And finally, I will read you a model answer. Today's question is, of course, based on the Elizabethan GCSE, so it's explain what was important about the Elizabethan Parliament. Now, let's start by comparing old and new Parliament. The parliament we know and love today is the centre of the country's government and one of the strongest and most influential legislative assemblies in the world. What is a legislative assembly? Is an assembly that passes laws. It is a permanent institution which permanently resides in Westminster Palace and has the last word on the most important decisions regarding the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and all the annexed territories. Think, for example, of the Brexit debates, and one of the reasons the entire affair of Brexit was so complicated and took so long and took a couple of snap elections in order to sort it out, to which extent we will see in the next years, but one of the reasons why the entire affair was so complicated was because of the presence of a strong opposition in Parliament. Now, don't forget all you think you know about modern Parliament, because the Tudor counterpart was a completely different institution. Of course, the name is the same, and some of its traditions date back to the 16th century, but it took a number of civil wars, a glorious revolution, an industrial revolution, and a couple of world wars for our parliament to become the institution we know and love today. Now, parliamentary history in itself is a very complicated and fascinating subject, but for our purpose, the table that I put in the transcript, which compares the differences between how the institution worked then and now, I think it summarizes the situation pretty well. Tudor parliaments were, first of all, not permanent institutions. There was not a building that was the parliament in which people sat all day, every day. It was instead called by the monarchs whenever they needed money, okay? All its decisions could be vetoed, that is, blocked, by the monarchs, and unlike today, the monarchs could also enter Parliament whenever and however they wanted. Now the Queen, for example, cannot enter Parliament. We have to thank Charles I's armed entrance in the House of Commons in 1642 when he tried to arrest five rebellious members of Parliament for this law that forbids monarchs from entering the House of Commons. Actually, small digression, if you're interested in how Britain became what it is, I think studying the Civil War and reading about the Civil War is actually can be a very interesting subject. Now, Parliament was also not elected by universal suffrage, meaning that universal suffrage is when everyone can elect their representative, okay? But at the time, both passive and elective suffrage, meaning the ability to vote and to be elected, were reserved only for literally the wealthiest 1% of the population. By 1780, almost 300 years, almost 250 years after the period we're studying, in a time of rapid growth of non-noble wealthy family, only 3% of the population could vote. In 1558, where the wealthy noble and gentry families were even fewer in numbers, the number of people who could vote and be voted was clearly much lower, so probably literally around 1% of the population. Of course, we do not have any meaningful statistics for the 16th century. Another main difference between the late medieval and modern parliament is the purpose. Today, as we said, parliament makes the laws about every aspect of civil life. Okay, it is the place where decisions are taken about pretty much everything. In the 16th century, however, they were used almost exclusively to raise taxes. It was part of an old medieval European tradition. Don't listen to people who will tell you that Britain's parliament is absolutely unique. It is starting from the 17th century, but before the 17th century, pretty much every kingdom in Europe, every feudal kingdom in Europe had its own sort of parliament. Again, it's part of a tradition that existed everywhere in medieval Europe, but which for some reasons that I will not explain here remain much stronger in England and survive to this day. If the king needed money, he needed to ask it nicely to an assembly of notables representing the country he ruled. For example, France had the Estates General, Germany had the Imperial Diet. I said Germany, but it's the Holy Roman Empire. Please forgive me. Spain, or even better, Castile, had the Cortes, and England had and still has Parliament. But while taxes were certainly the main reason, I mean, kings called Parliament because they needed money. They needed money 99% of the time to raise an army for a particular war. Okay, so they called the nobles, asked them, what do you want? If I need money, what do you want in return? And this is how the political process essentially worked in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. But while taxes were certainly the main reason why parliaments were summoned, and again, they were not a permanent institution, they were also used by the Tudor monarchs in order to rubber stamp certain decisions, in order to give the impression that they had popular support. I do something, and was that your idea? Yes, but look, the entire population of England is supporting me, or at least the 1% that votes for members of parliament. Why was that the case? Now, this was partly due to the fact that the Tudors themselves, while we associate them to Old England and we think of the Tudors as the old dynasty, at the time they're actually pretty new. Okay, the first Tudor had been Henry VII, who only started ruling in 1485. The Elizabethan age starts in 1558. And they started ruling after a bloody and terrible civil war. Okay. So they needed to use parliament in order to support their legitimacy, because there were still people who believed that the Tudors were not entitled to rule the country, even after a couple of generations. This use of the parliament as a rubber stamp was also due to the fact that throughout the 16th century, the country went through a seesaw of religious and political changes. You might remember that Henry VIII first persecuted the Protestant and got congratulations by the Pope. Then he created his own semi-Protestant church. Then his daughter Mary tried to undo everything. And then Elizabeth undid the undoing and made the Elizabethan religious settlement. Those were all huge changes which affected the whole population and therefore needed to be approved by an assembly that allegedly represented the entire country. In particular, when it came to religious changes, like what Henry VIII did of removing the authority of the Pope from the Church of England, because Henry VIII did not turn the Church of England Protestant. It remained in practice and in ritual fundamentally Catholic in its nature, with a few exceptions. The main difference was that the Pope did not have power on the Church anymore. The Church of England became actually hardline Protestant only with Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII. When you do a change like this, you need to show the rest of the world, especially the popes, especially the other Catholic monarchs, that what you did was approved by the people, and therefore you need to pass these laws through Parliament. And moving on to our object of study, Queen Elizabeth, we can say that Elizabeth made a very similar use of the institution. She called Parliament as soon as she was crowned in 1558. And she immediately used the Assembly to pass a number of laws. You will find them in the transcript. I will not read them all. But the main takeaway of this law, the main point of these laws is that they were remarkably similar and almost identical to the laws passed by Henry VIII. Keep this in mind. Now, to understand these laws, the Act of Supremacy, what are the other names? The First Fruits and Tenths Act, the Act of Uniformity, and so on, we need to look at the complicated personal history of Elizabeth. She was the least legitimate Tudor monarch so far, and at all, probably, because she was also the last Tudor monarch. She was last in the line of succession, meaning that there had been people before her who were much more entitled to the throne than she was. So her younger brother Edward VI had precedence over her because while he was much younger, he was male. However, he died young and he remained known as the Child King. Then there was also her older sister Mary, who had precedence over her because she was older. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. But she also died of possibly cancer, but her reign was generally regarded as a bit of a disgrace, and also she did not have any hair. Okay, she had a lot of hysterical pregnancies. Actually, the story of Mary, of Bloody Mary, is actually pretty tragic if you look at it from a human point of view. And the very bad publicity she got from historians is actually, I don't know, putting the knife in the wound, twisting the knife in the wound. Still, we're not talking here about Mary and her reign, who, while tragic, was, yes, a mess. Still, finally there was Elizabeth, who was the youngest female child of Henry VIII. Which is already a terrible position to be born in if you want to rule a country in the early modern period, or late Middle Ages. We're still sort of in the threshold. But she was also born out of a marriage, the one between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, which made many people suspicious. Many people still considered that marriage as illegal and illegitimate, okay? Because there were all sorts of reasons why the marriage between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn could be legitimate, especially because he married Anne Boleyn before he actually divorced from Catherine of Aragon, and there's a lot of variables there, but still. Main point is that a lot of people thought that it was an illegal marriage, and therefore the child born of this marriage was not entitled to the crown of England. If more people had started to think this way, had started to think that she was illegitimate, then the country was seriously at risk of entering into another civil war, because maybe a long-lost cousin or someone else who had married someone else 100 years ago, who descended from someone who had married someone else in the royal family a century before, could come out and say, I am the rightful heir to the throne of England, because the current queen is not legitimate. We have to remember again that this period, that the Elizabethan period, comes very soon after the War of the Roses, a terrible civil war that pitted families against families and families against each other, and it only happened 70 years earlier. Think of the importance World War II as for us, okay? How we still think in terms of Nazis and communists, and how we still celebrate the memory of those events, okay? While the War of the Roses was nowhere nearly as important and impactful, it was still very fresh in the memory of a lot of people, and it was still something that could happen again. And as everybody knows, as soon as a country enters a civil war, catastrophe happens, okay? It is very difficult to recover from that. So Elizabeth needed to show, in order to avoid a civil war, to remain on the throne and to remain alive, she needed to show everyone that she had the right to be on the throne and that the whole country was behind her. Therefore, she used the very first parliament, the one she called in 1558. Why did she call parliament? Because it was not a permanent institution. Remember, the monarchs had to call it. She used it to pass a series of laws that reverted all the changes that Mary had made to the Church of England. Again, Mary had put the Church of England once again under the authority of the Pope. Elizabeth undid that. Instead, Elizabeth reissued the very same laws that had been issued by her father Henry VIII in the first place. She also passed a law that made everyone who questioned her legitimacy a traitor and an enemy of the crown. Why did she do that? Very simply, she wanted everybody to know that she was the one and only legitimate queen, the real Protestant daughter of her Protestant father, and that she was effecting those changes to the law with the approval of the people. Once again, Parliament had been used to rubber stamp a royal decision that needed to look like it had popular approval. This didn't mean, however, that Parliament had any real power in the country. Okay? All the most important decisions were still taken by the Queen and by her inner circle of advisors, the Privy Council. Parliament did not have any power of agenda setting. What is agenda setting is the ability to make significant proposals or to direct the realm's policies, okay, to decide what needs to be done. That is agenda setting. This didn't mean that it didn't try, however. The Parliament really tried to, certain members of Parliament tried to influence the crown, trying to influence the Queen. Several MPs repeatedly asked the Queen to get married and give birth to a heir, again in order to remove the risk of a succession crisis and a civil war. But it was ignored repeatedly. Elizabeth remained unmarried until she died, essentially. So she didn't listen to Parliament. She promised she would, but she never did. Also, after the excommunication crisis of 1571, when the Pope Pius V, if I recall correctly, excommunicated Elizabeth, and Protestant enthusiasm in the country was at an all-time high, because now the Pope is officially our enemy, we should become more Protestant than before just to show him. So, after the excommunication, many MPs proposed a law to make the Book of Common Prayer more radically Protestant than what it already was. They were Puritans. Remember, we talked about Puritanism in the previous lesson. They were ignored. And the Queen even just shut down Parliament in order to avoid more proposals and to have to shut them down again. So she just decided, no, we're not doing this. So, to sum it up, 1. Parliament was not as powerful as it is today. 2. The Assembly was mostly called to raise taxes and to give the impression that the people approved the monarch's decision. 3. Elizabeth used it to consolidate her legitimacy. And 4. She also ignored Parliament when it didn't suit her political agenda. Now, I'm about to read the model answer. I would be pleased if you also read the model answer and then try to answer the exam question, which is write what was important about the Elizabethan Parliament. So, model answer. Following a long Tudor tradition, the English Parliament was used by Queen Elizabeth mostly in order to prove her legitimacy in the eyes of external observers, and to rubber stamp certain decisions taken by her and by her Privy Council. Most of the attempts made by the MPs to tell the Queen how to rule the country were either ignored or shut down. But this paragraph by itself, I think, would be a decent answer. We'll give you 2 points. Late medieval and early modern parliaments were temporary institutions called in to raise taxes and finance armies wherever necessary. They did not have many powers, and during the Tudor period, parliaments was mostly used to show to outside observers how certain decisions had the approval of the population. For example, Henry VIII made large use of the Parliament in order to show the Catholic world that his changes to the Church of England had popular support. Similarly, Elizabeth made use of the first Parliament in 1558, let me write the date, to publicly confirm a shaky legitimacy. Since she was the daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife Anne Boleyn, a marriage which many saw as illegitimate and illegal, and the successor of the popular Queen Mary I, of the unpopular Queen Mary I, Elizabeth made the conscious decision to use Parliament to pass laws that made her look as she was the one and only true heir of a Protestant father. To do that, she asked Parliament to repeal all the laws passed by Mary that reinstituted Catholicism in England, while at the same time reissuing all the religious laws passed by her father. By doing this, she wanted to tell all her potential opponents that she was the only legitimate Queen of England, descended from Henry VIII, and that she had the approval of the English people. However, the Queen was more than willing to ignore the advice of Parliament when it did not suit her agenda. She constantly evaded Parliament's request for a royal marriage and a secure succession, decided to remain unmarried all her life. Similarly, several attempts by some members of Parliament to change the Church of England along Puritan lines were also shut down by the Queen, who dissolved Parliament in 1571 after a proposal by MP Walter Strickland to make the contents of the Common Prayer Book more Puritan. These examples show us that Elizabeth, following the tradition of the other Tudor monarchs, saw Parliament as a place where her projects could be approved, but not as an autonomous political actor capable of governing the country. Okay, that's it for today. I'm looking forward to read your answers, and see you next time.